The power of Pan-Africanism. Imagine if Africa's nations stood truly united, economically, politically, and culturally. What could that mean for millions across the continent and the world? Without unity, Africa's wealth, cultures, and potential have been exploited, divided by foreign powers and economic systems that don't prioritize African interests. Today, the continent faces threats from outside and within, with resources often benefiting others instead of African nations themselves. The absence of unity makes it easier for foreign powers to influence African nations, allowing resources to be extracted at low cost, while entire economies rely on foreign intervention. This creates cycles of debt, poverty, and dependency that impact the lives of everyday Africans and African-descendant communities worldwide. But the dream of a united Africa, a Pan-African movement to foster unity, economic power, and pride, has been ignited by leaders who believed in self-reliance and empowerment. Whether you're in Africa or part of the global African diaspora, this vision connects us, inviting everyone to reflect on what Africa could be if it leveraged its potential as a unified force. By exploring the history, the figures, and the significance of Pan-Africanism, we can understand how this movement matters to us all today. Let's dive into the origins and the hope that Pan-Africanism brings to this generation, how the need for Pan-Africanism arose. Africa's journey toward unity begins in its history of colonial oppression. In the 19th century, European powers divided the continent in what became known as the Scramble for Africa, claiming territories, exploiting resources, and forcing African societies into systems designed to serve foreign interests. Colonizers placed artificial borders across communities that had previously shared languages, traditions, and trade. This division and exploitation robbed Africans of their resources and their independence. As African nations were reduced to mere resource suppliers for Europe, an urgent question arose: how could Africa reclaim its autonomy and identity? As the brutality of colonialism became increasingly unbearable, African and diaspora leaders began to envision a future in which African nations and people were no longer at the mercy of outside forces. The need for Pan-Africanism became a powerful answer to the desire for unity, self-determination, and resistance against oppression. Leaders realized that to reclaim their sovereignty, Africa needed to overcome divisions and foster solidarity across ethnic, national, and cultural lines. This vision wasn't just about individual freedom. It was about building a collective strength. The role of the African diaspora in shaping Pan-Africanism. The movement's beginnings were also shaped by the experiences of African-descendant communities outside of Africa. Many of the earliest Pan-African thinkers were from the Caribbean and the United States, where black communities faced systemic racism and oppression. Intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, although separated by an ocean, felt a profound connection to the African continent and understood the necessity for black people everywhere to unite in the face of shared struggles. Key figures of Pan-Africanism. The Pan-African movement is filled with influential leaders whose visions, courage, and actions paved the way for unity and independence. Let's explore some of these key figures. W.E.B. Du Bois. An intellectual force in the African American community, Du Bois is considered one of the founders of Pan-Africanism. He helped organize the first Pan-African Congress in 1900, a gathering that called for an end to colonialism and the liberation of African people. Du Bois believed that the liberation of Africa was essential to the empowerment of black people worldwide and argued for unity as a means of achieving social, economic, and political power. Marcus Garvey. A charismatic Jamaican activist and visionary, Garvey promoted a powerful message of black pride and economic self-sufficiency. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association UNIA and famously advocated for the Back to Africa movement, urging descendants of enslaved Africans to reconnect with their roots and even return to Africa. Garvey's vision of a united, self-reliant Africa inspired generations to embrace their heritage and fight for African autonomy. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah was deeply influenced by Du Bois and Garvey. After leading Ghana to independence in 1957, Nkrumah became a passionate advocate for a united Africa. He believed that African nations needed to form a collective front against neocolonialism. His message was clear: true independence could only be achieved through a united continent. Nkrumah's vision of a United States of Africa continues to inspire advocates of Pan-Africanism to this day. Haile Selassie. As the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie represented one of the few African nations that had resisted colonial rule. Selassie's speeches on African unity and self-defense resonated globally, especially after Ethiopia's successful resistance against Italian invasion in the 1930s. He played a central role in the creation of the Organization of African Unity (OAU) in 1963, a precursor to the African Union. His leadership emphasized the importance of Africa's voice on the world stage. Imagine a world where the visionaries and leaders who inspired Pan-Africanism had never risen up, where the call for African unity, independence, and pride never echoed across the continent or resonated with the African diaspora. What if, in the absence of Pan-Africanism, Africa remained fragmented, vulnerable to external manipulation, and disconnected from its heritage? Without this unifying force, we could be looking at a very different Africa today, one that struggles under deepened divisions, a weakened global voice, and limited economic strength. Political fragmentation and vulnerability. Without Pan-Africanism, African nations would have been even more vulnerable to continued colonization or neo-colonial influence. The spirit of independence, embodied in leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Patrice Lumumba, might not have ignited, and the collective push for freedom could have been staggered, disjointed, or delayed. Economic stagnation and dependency. One of the primary pillars of Pan-Africanism is self-reliance, building economies that serve African interests rather than depending on external powers. Without Pan-African ideals, African nations might have missed the emphasis on economic cooperation, inter-African trade, and development. Countries would be less likely to pool resources, share knowledge, or collaborate in building continental infrastructure projects, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA), which aims to boost intra-African trade. Loss of cultural pride and identity. Pan-Africanism is not just about political or economic unity. It's about cultural reclamation and pride. It champions the value of African heritage, history, and identity, empowering people to take pride in who they are and where they come from. Without Pan-Africanism, the narrative that African culture, languages, and traditions are less than might have persisted unchecked. This could have resulted in the widespread loss of traditional knowledge, language, and heritage across the continent. A weak global voice for Africa. Pan-Africanism has given African nations a platform on the world stage, allowing them to unite and advocate for shared concerns, from economic policies to environmental issues. Without it, each country would face the world alone, unable to address global challenges with the weight of collective support. This could leave African nations struggling to have their interests represented in international institutions and agreements. Disconnection of the African diaspora. The Pan-Africanist movement has helped connect the African diaspora with their heritage, building a bridge between continents. It has strengthened cultural, economic, and intellectual ties between Africans and people of African descent around the world. Without Pan-Africanism, these ties might never have formed. African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and other members of the diaspora might feel even more distanced from their cultural roots, and the shared sense of identity and solidarity among people of African descent worldwide could be far weaker. Without Pan-Africanism, Africa would be a continent with fewer tools to navigate global challenges, less cultural pride, and more vulnerability to external manipulation. But because Pan-Africanism exists, African nations and the African diaspora are empowered to reclaim their narratives, collaborate for mutual success, and inspire generations with the vision of a united, resilient Africa. The Pan-African Congresses. The Pan-African Congresses were pivotal events that brought together leaders and activists from across the globe to discuss the liberation of African nations and address the challenges facing Black people worldwide. These congresses, starting in the early 20th century, became a platform for shaping Pan-African ideals and organizing resistance against colonialism. The 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester was particularly influential, as it included future African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, who would later lead their countries to independence. Key goals of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism has several core goals, which have evolved over time as the movement has adapted to new challenges. 1. Unity across African nations. Pan-Africanism emphasizes the importance of solidarity among African nations. By uniting, African countries can form a stronger collective to stand against exploitation, both from within and outside the continent. 2. Self-reliance and economic independence. A cornerstone of the movement, self-reliance focuses on reducing dependency on foreign powers. This means investing in local industries, supporting African businesses, and fostering economic systems that prioritize African interests. 3. Cultural pride and reclamation. Pan-Africanism encourages Africans, and those in the diaspora, to embrace and celebrate their cultural heritage. By reclaiming African history, languages, and traditions, the movement aims to restore pride and identity to communities that were often marginalized and erased. 4. Political freedom and anti-colonialism. One of the earliest goals of Pan-Africanism was to end colonial rule across Africa. Although most African nations gained independence by the 1960s, the struggle for true political autonomy continues, as many countries face the challenges of neo-colonialism and foreign interference. 5. Global Black solidarity. Pan-Africanism extends beyond the borders of Africa, seeking to unite people of African descent worldwide. By fostering connections and shared goals, the movement strengthens the global African community and advocates for justice and equality. The impact and legacy of Pan-Africanism. The Pan-African movement has left an indelible mark on African and global politics. Many African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, largely inspired by Pan-African ideals. The establishment of the Organization of African Unity (OAU) in 1963, now known as the African Union, was a direct result of Pan-African advocacy. This organization has since provided African nations with a platform for diplomacy, conflict resolution, and collective decision-making. Pan-Africanism's influence is also visible in cultural movements, including the global embrace of African identity and heritage. The African diaspora continues to connect with the continent through initiatives in education, business, and the arts, driven by the spirit of unity and pride that Pan-Africanism champions. The challenges facing Pan-Africanism today. Despite its impact, Pan-Africanism faces significant challenges in the modern world. Economic dependency and neo-colonialism. Many African nations still rely on foreign aid and investment, which can limit their ability to make independent decisions. This dependency can lead to policies that serve external interests over those of local communities. Political fragmentation. With 54 countries, each with its own unique challenges and governance, achieving unity is complex. Conflicts, political instability, and corruption can undermine Pan-African goals, making it difficult for nations to collaborate effectively. Cultural differences. Africa is home to a rich diversity of cultures, languages, and traditions. While this diversity is a strength, it can also be a challenge when promoting unity across such varied backgrounds. The future of Pan-Africanism. As Africa navigates the challenges of globalization, Pan-Africanism offers a vision for a self-reliant, united continent that can thrive on the world stage. Today's leaders, intellectuals, and activists are reviving and reimagining Pan-Africanism for the 21st century. There is a growing movement to build stronger African economies, improve education, and foster technological innovation. Additionally, the African Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA) aims to create a single market across the continent, promoting economic cooperation and growth. The role of the African diaspora also remains crucial. Through initiatives in technology, arts, and social advocacy, the diaspora contributes to Africa's development and helps to amplify African voices globally. As Pan-Africanism continues to evolve, it remains a powerful force